Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I want to introduce you to today's guest, Lukas Haynes. Luke is a New York-based veteran philanthropy executive who now works only with family clients doing a blend of giving, charitable, political, and impact investing. Lukas advises major donors on strategy and investments to maximize the impact and leverage of their philanthropic, political, and commercial investments. He worked with 15 Rockefeller trustees as CEO of the David Rockefeller Fund from 2015 to 2022 and spent 20 years dispersing and evaluating foundation grants to promote national security, climate solutions, justice, democracy, and community development, beginning at the MacArthur Foundation in 2002. From 2000 to 2001, Haynes had a presidential appointment at the U.S. Department of State and wrote for Secretary of State Madeline Albright during visits to 30 countries abroad. He was a Harvard University Kennedy School Fellow in 2001 and earned a master's degree in international relations from Oxford University. He was published in the New York Times, The Economist, the Boston Globe, Comparative Strategy, and the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Haynes is a visiting distinguished fellow at Stanford University's Center on Philanthropy and a board member of Rihanna's Clara Lionel Foundation and the Sepsis Alliance. He is a graduate cum laude of the College of William and Mary, and he advocates for sepsis mitigation through Lulu's Law, named for his late daughter and first introduced as a bipartisan bill in the United States Congress in 2022. Luke, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to say that Lulu's Law will be reintroduced Thursday, April 18th, with bipartisan co-sponsors in the U.S. House.
Congratulations. We're thrilled to have you here to talk about taking risks throughout your career and how that's led you to a life of professional and personal fulfillment.
Welcome. Our mission with the show to really help our audience to become bolder and wiser. You have several notable inflection points throughout your career, from foreign policy, going to Oxford, Oxfam, presidential appointment, to philanthropy, and then leaving this executive leadership role at the Rockefeller Foundation to start your own advisory practice. One of the things that you talked about doing prep is this not being afraid of major transitions in career. Maybe we can start off on that perspective.
Yeah, the process of going about and cobbling together a career has some major forks in the road. It has some serendipity. It has some forethought and planning. My general reflection is that when you face a moment, whether you're unsatisfied professionally or you need to make a change personally, the way you go about thinking about that change and transition, it can be scary and it can come with risk. But if you do a little bit of reflection and a little bit of planning and listen to your gut, these forks in the road can open up really exciting new frontiers that lead to a new depth of professional and personal fulfillment that you might not even imagine on the other side of the juncture. One of the big transitions happened even before I finished my graduate work. I had been working on studying and working for a think tank around the war in former Yugoslavia. And I got to a point after several years of studying the conflict from afar in Washington and then in Oxford that I got just very frustrated with this distance. And I happened to be in the town where this worldwide humanitarian organization, Oxfam, was started. And so I walked up the road to Oxfam headquarters and I went in and found a meeting with the head of the former Yugoslavia program. And I said, I really want to get more involved. I really want to get feet on the ground. And I'm willing to volunteer, drive a truck, load supplies. I would just love to get to the Balkans. He was first a little puzzled by this request. And then he looked at my resume and we talked more about what I'd done. And he said, I think I can do better than a truck driver. We're at this moment of deciding whether it's premature or time to introduce longer term rehabilitation development assistance back into former Yugoslavia as the war was winding down, but we're not sure. And what about going and being a political analyst and helping us understand how conditions on the ground are changing? And that led to a new role in the organization. And then, as often happens with humanitarian organizations, there was so much fatigue and burnout among the staff that I quickly became the acting regional representative for the entire program with sub offices in Bosnia, Croatia, or Serbia, and Kosovo. A lot of what followed in the first chapter of my career is a result of taking a risk and then executing on the challenge, and then finding myself promoted at age 25 into a role I could scarcely imagine.
Luke, I'm curious to hear how risk manifested for you in that decision. There's clearly the physical risk that was involved in going to an area like the one you were in. What other risks did you feel you were taking at the time?
The course of study, which had been planned as a 3-year DPhil program, it's not quite a PhD, but it's somewhat equivalent in the UK setting, probably wasn't going to play out if I took the extra time to turn what began as a summer assignment as an analyst into this bigger role. That role in Sarajevo led to a similar roving and strategic advisory role in West Africa. And I was in Sierra Leone and Liberia with Oxfam for 6 months until a coup forced me out. I took some academic risks to answer the question. I could barely afford the program that I was in. I knew it was going to probably take longer than I could afford to do it without full-time work. And though there was some compensation in this job, it really just forced uncertainty around when I would get my graduate work done and, frankly, whether I might even finish it.
And what gave you the conviction to know that you were taking a risk worth taking?
I think I'd been really influenced by my first job out of college working for the president of this think tank in DC called the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And through him meeting colleagues like a fellow intern named Samantha Power, who would go on to be a journalist in Bosnia and then start a center at Harvard and become US ambassador to the United Nations. The experience was to be surrounded by people with incredible intelligence, but also passion and conviction for what they were working on. They helped instill in me a faith that if I sought quality learning opportunities and I trusted my ability to learn and to adapt to a challenge in the field, that there was an intrinsic merit in this experience, and maybe even more merit than the value of a paper degree, even from an institution like Oxford. And that faith was rewarded. I met incredible people. I was challenged with work and personally in ways that led to personal growth and then new connections that I could barely imagine. For a certain type of planner, especially career planner, it's easy to anticipate downside risk, but we often underestimate the upside value of taking risk, the connections that are made, the value of executing or excelling at the work. And time and again, I have found this to be the case myself. I think really hard about the risk, and then I'm almost always surprised at unanticipated benefits of taking the risk.
So from Oxford to Oxfam, did you come back and finish the degree as you intended? Did that experience change you the way you finished the degree?
I did finish the degree, but not in the timeline that I had ever planned. One of those connections that I made actually taking a weekend off and going to the seaside resort city of Dubrovnik is I met a high-ranking official in the US government who presented an opportunity to audition for a speechwriting job with President Bill Clinton. I wrote a speech for that purpose. And Turns out they liked it, but they needed somebody with top secret security clearance to start very quickly. And so I was passed over for that opportunity, but they felt so badly that they gave me another opportunity to audition for Madeline Albright. And I ended up being a speechwriter for Secretary of State Albright for the last year of the administration. That opportunity and that work further delayed the completion of my graduate studies. I eventually decided not to finish the doctorate and to tie it off with the master's dissertation. That's still a decision that I sometimes wonder about. It probably cut off certain options to work in academia, but I certainly don't regret the choices that I made, the jobs that I took, and the opportunities that those led to eventually.
What was that experience like to write for Albright?
It's still the most intense work experience I've ever had. And that's coming from someone who actually was evacuated from a coup and a situation of chaos in the streets of Sierra Leone in 1997. The intensity of speech writing is a function of you're working for somebody whose every hour of every day is predetermined. While traveling, there are multiple events every day. You don't have time to get used to jet lag. You don't have time to recharge your batteries. You barely have time to sleep. And every word that comes out of the mouth of the Secretary of State of the United States matters, whether diplomatically in terms of the words we choose and what they mean for U.S. policy and conflict mediation, or just in terms of the value of what the Secretary of State is saying as an inspiring person to non-governmental organizations and their leaders and to the publics of other countries or to the media that's always paying attention to every single thing she says. I learned to work under pressure. I learned attention to detail. I learned that I had reserves of energy and stamina that I couldn't imagine. I made mistakes. I learned the consequences of those mistakes. And I also learned the awesome power of the United States of America and the cabinet officers like Secretary of State and the effect that their words can have on events and on people, lots of people.
I think about the amount of imposter syndrome one could have. I'm in my 20s. I'm writing for the United States with this full power behind me, with that responsibility. Did you feel the imposter syndrome at the time?
I've often had imposter syndrome, and I think it's a function of where I grew up and the sort of circles that I wanted to get into in my career and academically. And that was maybe the most powerful case of not quite feeling up to the job. I felt that with Oxfam as well. And as Michelle read out that ridiculously long bio, I still feel it looking back and thinking about some of the things that I've been given the opportunity to do. But to answer the question, I think you just put your head down and do the work. And you look alongside and other speechwriters and other political appointees who are working crazy long hours, 7 days a week. And they're just too busy to worry about things like that. The fact is, you've got a job to do. There are people expecting a set of remarks delivered by email or delivered in hand or walked up to the front of the plane or walked up to the podium at the last second. And you just focus on doing the best job that you can do minute after minute, hour after hour, and taking stock of what it all added up to at the end.
What I'm hearing is the momentum of risk-taking snowballing to give you bigger opportunities. And I'm wondering, how much of the habit of mind do you think that's learned from your journey is that momentum? And how much is it other habits of mind that you form that support being able to be successful in those moments?
I think momentum's a great way to think about it. And the opposite is of momentum is when you lose energy and you begin to feel like you're languishing a little bit in the role that you've been in. And I have had these moments several times now Sometimes it's almost exactly that 7-year itch when I felt I don't quite have the momentum. I don't quite have the daily passion and zest for the work. And it's time to sit back, do a little reflection, reach out to people, who are really vested in your full self and the balance of work and life, and think hard about what is the next best full application of your energy and your accumulated experience. I was forced to have a moment of reflection like that when the presidential election of 2000 turned out the way it did, and I was forced to figure out a new role. And I found myself in the same position in the months before I left my Rockefeller Foundation job in 2022.
Do you want to talk about that transitioning to the philanthropy world?
So I was very bummed out, as a lot of political appointees are, at the moment of a presidential election. My glide path was from working for Madeline Albright as a Clinton appointee to probably working in the Gore White House as a speechwriter. That's why I was in Nashville the election night of 2000 with other Gore speechwriters. As things turn out, I was given the gift of time between 2000, in the year 2001, to really think hard about my next phase, which I knew would coincide with trying to start a family and secure reliable income stream for that purpose. And I'd had this exciting set of experiences working abroad, traveling to 30 countries in a year. I wanted to settle down and reconnect with friends. So I was very deliberate about talking to the think tank world again in DC, where I'd worked, interviewing with the UN system, thinking about the academic route. I found myself at the Kennedy School in a perfect setting to weigh the pros and cons of trying to craft a sort of policy relevant academic career, as many do at the Kennedy School. I threw my hat into a foundation interview opportunity. And funny story I didn't share with you, but I was initially rejected for the job at the MacArthur Foundation. I got a letter it was the classic one-page form letter, but it didn't feel right because I'd gone to Chicago and had such a good interview and even dinner with the hiring manager. And I thought, I just have to double check. So I called the HR department, the MacArthur Foundation, and they say, "Oh my goodness, this is a terrible mistake. You got the wrong letter." I often wonder what would have happened if I had not made that phone call.
Wow.
But it led to an incredible 5-year run at the MacArthur Foundation where I was able to work on foreign policy, national security issues with the power of a grant making portfolio and support to all the major think tanks in Washington and many academic policy institutes around the world. And that was the beginning of a 20-year career in endowed foundation grant making, which has become a sort of solid core of my work. I just consider myself incredibly fortunate that one meaningful opportunity has led to another and allowed me to keep working on issues and problems that I care about. That old adage about if you care about what you're doing, it doesn't quite feel like work has really been true for me. The way I talk about this to students and interns is if you care about what you're working on and you do it well, and you're thoughtful about the jobs that you take and the managers that you accept, and you continue to interview up, as they say, and find people who care about you and respect the work that you're doing, you will be rewarded in doors opening, your managers, your bosses, your board members, your investors, opening the next door for you. In this very competitive world that leaders find themselves in, you need that extra help. You just can't do it yourself, no matter how good the work is. I started out with some great managers, luckily, but then I was thoughtful about making sure I was working with people that were going to take that extra interest in me.
I'm curious, how much change was there in those managers in the time that you worked for them? That's one thing to pick the person that you work for, but often that thing will change if someone goes on to retire or take a new opportunity. And I'd love to know how, if at all, you had to react to that.
I don't think I really did to adjust to management change above, partly because I was in several roles for less than 2 years. And then I was at MacArthur for 5 and had stable single boss for 7 after that. And then I was working for a board where there was change, working with changing board members and board chairs. And I've always thought of that as a partnership between leadership and board. And in fact, I've asked that question when I interviewed with the David Rockefeller Fund family trustees. I said to the young board chair, how do you imagine this relationship as more of a hierarchical top-down management or as a partnership? And he hadn't thought about that going in because it was his first board chair role. And on the spot, he came up with the right answer, and it would set the tone for the next several years of working together and managing change at the board level. It was a partnership, and he learned from me and I learned from him, and we navigated leadership of the organization together.
I love that idea of interviewing someone and in the interview process, learning to be in partnership together. And I do think that has a lot of applicability for lots of different types of roles.
Yeah, you have these moments early in a role, in a relationship, can be really formidable and shape the nature of the role and the relationship. Sometimes I think we back into them more passively than we might. I don't remember why I asked the question, except it felt for me going into my first executive director and what became a CEO role, like the right question going in. We all have moments in our life that become before and after moments. And that moment in my life was losing a daughter at age 4 from a sudden illness. This was about 7 years into the job before Rockefeller. And like so many grieving parents, I was drifting for some weeks there. And I knew I needed a change, but I wasn't thinking about it very proactively. And then this opening at Rockefeller, it came to my attention. And I initially passed on the idea, but decided, what the heck? Is there any downside in not pursuing it? I knew it would be a long process and the right answer would emerge from the process. And I found myself in that interview of the board chair, and they asked the question, why this job and why now? And it was a tough gut call moment. Do you present the full honest answer and risk introducing a very heavy topic into the conversation, the death of your child just months ago, or do you fake it? And I just went with my gut. And I remember part of me, there was a voice in the back of my head saying, you've just walked through literally the valley of death. This is an interview. Like, what's the risk here in being yourself? And it happened that the 4 family members who were interviewing me had just lost a brother, nephew, uncle from the board from a sudden accident. And that had been an important voice on the board. And it led to this really wonderful, meaningful conversation about what they were hoping to do in the next chapter of the foundation of life and what they had lost in their family member trustee. And I was able to say, if I'm going to spend 40 to 60 hours at work every week away from my surviving child. I want it to matter. I want every minute on the job to matter. I want to care about the job. I want to care about the issues that I'm working on. And that happened to be a pretty compelling answer to them. And I got the job.
That's a beautiful story of how vulnerability creates trust in moments like that. And I'd love to hear more about the wisdom that you have around vulnerability and trust in the after times of how that's evolved for you.
It is cliche, but absolutely true that we all process death and loss very differently. And there's no right answer. But for me, my coping has been to be very honest about the experience and what it's meant for me and how I want to make meaning out of it going forward. And that requires trust that you can be vulnerable emotionally and people won't take advantage of you, but also that they're going to hear you with the sincerity and the authenticity that you bring. And they're not going to see this as somehow a manipulative kind of emotional ploy. And honestly, I still sometimes wonder, like, is this a person or is this a setting where I want to talk about my loss? But whenever I do, I find that we all carry something. We all carry some kind of experience. But if we all are fortunate to live long enough, we all end up coping with a very meaningful, deep loss close to us. I don't think American society actually does a great job talking about loss and supporting people through loss. And this country's gone through a lot of trauma, even before the pandemic with the opioid epidemic and 20 years of nonstop warfare abroad. And so I think vulnerability, I think emotional authenticity can lead to really meaningful relationships, not just in your life personally, but in the workplace. And I've definitely found in the last 7 years, and it's been 10 years since Lulu died. I feel like my life is actually richer for that honest.
I'm sure. And I had the pleasure of meeting and knowing Lulu and would just love to hear what other wisdom you took from her around taking risks and your journey.
Yeah. Every child is special to their parents, obviously. I really do think that there was a special quality to Lulu that was larger than the personality of many 4-year-olds. She had an extraordinary confidence and exuberant energy. She just radiated this energy. Even her older brother knew this, acknowledged this. And she approached every new encounter with neighbor, classmate, teacher, stranger with this kind of fearless self-confidence. And I channeled that in taking risks going forward. But I think the most important lesson that we can learn from all young children is living in the present. You just can't take anything for granted. And it becomes all too painfully clear when you lose a child suddenly and making every day as meaningful as you can make it with the requirements of work and family and other obligations. I think I can fairly say that I've been more thoughtful and intentional about my work life and actually the way I lead my personal life. It's losing Lulu. In that way, sort of her spirit of voracious hunger to live every day joyfully, I hope lives on.
Absolutely. And you talked about the joy of being an entrepreneur and how much you've enjoyed this professional chapter that you're in right now. I'd love to hear what inspired that and what that evolution looked like from Rockefeller Fund to here.
It's a culmination of managing a lot of change over 7 years and feeling quite proud and satisfied with all that had been changed at that family, fifth generation family foundation in relatively short space of time. But it coincided with the pandemic, the racial justice reckoning in the United States after George Floyd's death, the 2020 election, the risk to climate solutions and federal climate policy that came with that election. And I just decided it all came together over 6 months that after 20 years of grant making to tax exempt charitable organizations, I needed to feel new agency. I needed to work with a new set of clients that were as concerned about democracy and the climate crisis as I was, and try to help steer and shape their philanthropic and other resources in constructive ways. And I was lucky to be introduced to a couple of clients who fit that description, and I've been working with them for over 2 years. And what's really exciting is that we go beyond the charitable dollar and we blend political giving with charitable giving with impact investing. And I wrote an article for the Stanford Social Innovation Review under that Stanford Fellowship, which basically argued that tax exempt charitable giving was not going to have as much impact on democracy as this blend of capital that's charitable, political, and impact investing oriented. And I believe that as an advisory thesis to clients very strongly, that we need to be activating all different stacks of capital, and actually the agency and the social networks, the cultural, social, political capital of clients as well, given the scale of the challenges that we're confronting in the United States and beyond.
I'm interested to know how you define success. You've been around people who can write those big checks, and you've learned a lot on your journey. What's success for you?
Oh, it's a hard question. And I think it really depends on the context, whether it's in my work life or in my personal life, charitable, extracurricular life. I think applying your talent to causes that matter to you and seeing some positive impact on the organizations, your colleagues, those you manage is part of the formula for me. The financial reward is obviously one measure, but I've found the quality of relationships with those that I've tried to mentor or partners that I've worked with, other leaders in the field, other board members, colleagues, and a sense that I'm a valued part of the ecosystem that I've been working in as a more satisfying measure. I also think that one sense of a career or timeline, it's just less relevant with every passing decade. AI may be the ultimate disruptor in the way we think about that going forward. But as I look back, it's easier, obviously, in retrospect to organize the resume into chapters, but there are distinct periods and phases. I had an exploratory period where I went from one relatively short-term meaningful opportunity to another. And then I did settle down for 20 years in 3 different roles. And now I'm in a new phase. It's an exciting phase. I have no idea how long it's going to last. Hopefully my clients remain with me through the end of the year. There's risk in leaving the steady state, solid, secure, with great benefits institutional role. But again, I have some faith that if I'm following my instincts, I'm applying my talents and my experience well, that risk will be rewarded. And so far it has been, with compensation and even more impact on the causes that I care about. And who knows what the future phases might look like. I hope I get to retire when I want to retire, but I don't imagine a passive retirement, just traveling and sitting on the beach. I want to be actively engaged in local community, national life, maybe even international work again. And that's exciting. That's my theory of the case going forward. And let's hope it plays out as well as I've been fortunate to have the work I've had for the last 20 plus years.
Well, look, it's been such a journey, and we could go on for hours because I know there's stories we haven't gotten to. But along the lines of having just such conviction around using your time wisely to have an impact, would love to have any recommendations that you have for our audience in terms of things to read and engage with to become bolder and wiser versions of themselves.
Timothy Snyder's really small, almost pamphlet called On Tyranny is a powerful set of historical insights to help us think about a really tumultuous time in domestic and international politics. Lydia Millet's A Children's Bible is a powerful, relatively short novel that really brings the emotional impact of climate change home for me. And to pick up the theme that we've talked about, making meaning, a couple of years ago, I picked up Viktor Frankl's Search for Meaning again. And it just remains as profound as it's ever been, as far as this unique ability that human beings have, distinct from the natural world, to make meaning out of hardship and suffering. The other is a book called Rest, and I can't pronounce the name of the author, but it was this amazing set of insights about how productive people have organized their daily life. A couple of the takeaways were we each only have several really productive hours in us each day. And it's important to recognize what part of the day those hours fall into, whether it's morning, afternoon, or even sometimes late at night. For those of us who might feel guilty about the less productive hours, there's a reassurance in this book that collects all the stories of innovators and writers and scholars and scientists that the mind is always working in the background on hard problems that require creative solution, but making time for long walks, making time for naps if you're a napper, making sure that you have the rest that you need creates the sort of background processing power to come up with those answers that drive your productivity and creativity.
I can totally relate to that. I think Naval put it differently. Working like a lion versus working like a cow. Instead of grazing for long hours, you work like a lion, you hunt, and then you rest.
Yeah.
Luke, now that you are your boss and you have the ability to create this rest for yourself, and you have this history of designing alliances with your bosses where you've set the tone for the relationship. As a coach, I often hear people talk about full-time work as signing the blank check for all the hours to be outside of their control. And I'm wondering what advice you would give to folks who feel that way about how they might claim some of this rest for themselves and design a new alliance.
Yeah. I think it begins with a faith in yourself and a confidence to trust what works for you within the context of your job and requirements and expectations of your managers, and not to feel guilty and not get into less productive arguments or renegotiation. Just do the work as best you feel you can execute it in the ways that we just talked about, and let the results stand for themselves. Never quite solved this problem myself when I was in a salaried role, of feeling like I'd put in exactly what my board or bosses might have expected. But over time, with the benefit of looking back on and being proud of accomplishment or hearing the praise of your colleagues, I gain more confidence going forward. I know myself. I know what it takes for me to be productive and deliver on expectations better than anybody else. I'm not going to have an invisible person sitting on my shoulder, looking over my shoulder, making me feel guilty.
And the last words of advice for folks who are looking to be bolder and wiser on their journey.
I guess I have the It's kind of cheery optimism based on positive experience, but I think it's worth listening to that inner voice at any point in time or in your professional life, and trying to align what you do well and do best with the role that you seek for yourself or you find yourself in. And when you do that, it really doesn't feel like work.
There's so much wisdom in what you shared. A lot for your time
And
and your inspiration. I feel like I walking away with some of your borrowed confidence and conviction in staying true to what you really value.
it's very generous and been a pure pleasure. You're both terrific at this, and I admire what you're trying to do to inspire all of us out here to be our best selves in the workplace.